Well, thank you, and thank you to all the technical and professional team at ASAP for making this possible. My presentation today will be what happens after Chiari surgery. How do you enhance your recovery following surgery? Next slide. And yes, I treat men as well. The previous slide, of course, we know this disorder is more common in women, it does occur in men. These are both post-operative patients. They're actually different, but you can see a lot of people go back to a vibrant life. Next slide. Now, your initial post-operative care will be managed by your neurosurgeon and the neurosurgeon's team. The main caution following surgery is the development of a fluid pocket in the back of your neck, as you can see in this dramatic image. And of course, even worse would be if that popped open and leaked spinal fluid. So please know your practice phone number, the number to call if the office is closed, and who is going to take care of you in the immediate post-operative period. Next slide. So we're going to talk about following, the initial management. We're so focused on this for folks that over time, a team at the Medical Center of Aurora, we developed these guides. As you can see, there were 4 pillars: sleep, nutrition, fitness, and rejuvenation. Next slide. And this is an example, for instance, of the nutrition guide developed by our nutritionist. Next slide. But now we have to add a new pillar. And that new pillar is connections. It's connections amongst each other. Next slide. My spouse, Suzanne, had found this Overcoming Loneliness article in New York Times, which is an excellent resource. And as you see, the question is, how is loneliness damaging our health? Next slide. And here's some interesting quotes from that article. Before the pandemic, the US was apparently already developing an epidemic of loneliness driven by our accelerated pace of life, the spread of technology, and it edged out the time-consuming messiness of real relationships. The Kaiser Family Foundation actually studied this, and 1 in 5 Americans said they were always or often felt lonely or socially isolated. So frankly, I think this information is a bit of an eye-opener, or should be for all of us. Next slide. The pandemic made things worse. For 2 years, you didn't see friends like you used to. You missed your colleagues from work, maybe even the barista. You were lonely. We all were. Next slide. So interestingly, the brain views loneliness as a risk, as a threat. The brain registers loneliness as a threat. The amygdala, that fight or flight fear area in our brain, gets triggered. Our heart rate, blood pressure, and blood sugar increase, and we even produce inflammatory cells preparing for some potential threat from loneliness. So loneliness is a major issue. Next slide. And one of the things to help turn around, of course, is staying connected with family or reconnected if you have drifted away. And this can be a very powerful emotional curative. Next slide. So we should be, whenever possible, with family, friends, neighbors, coworkers. Maybe invite your neighbor to dinner as a start. Possibly a number of you already do that. Next slide. Interestingly, merely walking into a door of a house of worship can be good for your overall health and wellness. I know a lot of people that attend, and I think that's a given. Next slide. Join a social group, clean up the parks, maybe a food bank. You're joining a group with like-minded people. And that's safer or easier for us, at least initially, okay? Next slide. Take a structured class. Again, you're there involved with like-minded people, painting, drama, digital photography, creating videos. Next slide. But don't ignore people we may disagree with. We have to continue to bond with those that disagree with, at least however we can. Next slide. One thing we did is we created a book club, two couples, Suzanne and I and another couple, and we meet once a month, and we rotate who selects the next book, and we sit down and have a meal and discuss it. Here's an example of some of the books, and you may not agree with all of them, or people may have different points of view, but that's the beauty of this sharing. Next slide. Intellectual stimulation has been studied, and it protects against cognitive decline. Playing chess or board games reduces the chances of mild cognitive impairment by 22%, crafts by 28%, working on the computer by 30%. These are actually significant reductions. Next slide. Go to a museum. They're lovely museums. This one's nearby in Chicago for you. Next slide. And amazing art. Next slide. And you're sharing a common experience with other people that also appreciate, let's say, the arts. And you may have brief interactions. You may both roll your eyes to something unusual or really be enchanted by something that you love. Next slide. Bring your kids or grandkids to the museums. Let them participate. Next slide. And in this, the final slide in this section is the concept of Ubuntu. Now, this Bob Verity, who's a naturalist, was invited by the world's largest neurosurgical organization, Cushing Society, part of the AANS. So clearly his works, his thinking is deep and he's connected. And Ubuntu in Zulu means I am because of you. So what does that mean? What does it mean? Well, if we are socially isolated singly by ourselves, what are we? We are because of the people around us, the interchange, maybe the discussions, the debates, the caring, maybe there's argument, etc. We are because of the others around us. So connection is vital to human health. Next slide. Nutrition will be brief. I've spoken on this several times before. Next slide. Hydration. We do have to remember the body cannot function without adequate fluids. Next slide. Here's what hydration does for us. I can't read all of this, but it's significant. We need to stay hydrated. Next slide. Now, as far as diets, I don't have to deep dive because I'm going to use here at least this recent survey by the U.S. News and World Report, and here's their ranking. So frankly, pick any of these 6 and you're going to do fine. There's a lot of similarities, but there's some differences. But focus on your nutrition. As we all know, we're being sold materials, food materials, that are really unhealthy for us. Next slide. At least many of them. If you decide on the Mediterranean diet, I strongly recommend this book. Why? Because it's a couple. They live in St. Petersburg, Florida. They own a sailboat, and they sail throughout the Mediterranean, Southern Europe and Northern Africa, and learn the culinary traditions of those areas. So it's it's an engaging, delightful book. Next slide. These slides you've probably seen. You don't hear the term much of paleo diet like I used to speak on. It's now mostly referred to as ancestral nutrition. And I still think of this diet, the diet of our ancestors, of if somebody's in really a critical situation, as you see here, the changes can be dramatic, as you see on the right. Next slide. Again, before ancestral nutrition on the right, after ancestral nutrition, marked. They're changing physiologically, mentally, emotionally to the better. Next slide. The opposite condition can also be healed through ancestral nutrition, and basically fix the gut and you fix the person. As you see, she had anorexia nervosa on the left, and now on the right, a very vibrant individual. Next slide. Now, kind of a new concept to think about, or at least new terminology, is that we are superorganisms. It can be a little spooky in a way, and we know some of this already, and we don't face it, we just accept it. And so, again, we're superorganisms, and what does that mean? Next slide. Next slide is that we cannot live without bacteria and viruses in our body. Our human cells, their estimate, as you see, about 37 trillion. But our human cells are markedly outnumbered by bacteria and viruses. And that's the concept of a superorganism. Without these microorganisms, we could not live. So we're a combination. I know it's hard to accept in a way, but it's just the reality. Next slide. And they're located all throughout the body. And again, we cannot do without them. Next slide. Next. Here's an example. There's a photomicrograph of the gut microbiome. It's not what we want to eat. It's what our bugs want us to keep healthy. Let me just rephrase that a little bit. When we eat something, we're thinking we're doing it, we want to eat that. And yes, there's a lot of attractive food out there, and I'm guilty as well, you know, a big pastry, whatever. That's not what our bugs want. And they're the ones that are keeping us healthy. So when we eat, we're eating for them to help us. Next slide. Fermented foods prepared with bacterial are vital. If you're new to these, discuss it with your doctor. Next slide. And here's just one slide. I won't go into the deep science, but this is just an example, okay? This is a paper written in 2018. The microglia in the brain control the astrocytes in response to microbial metabolites. Now, what does all that mean? Next slide. Well, it's like solving a crime. Gut bacteria create metabolites. They create substances that impact our microglia in the brain, that can impact the astrocytes, that impact the brain cells. So the your brain cells, our brain cells, are dependent on, do we have friendly, good gut bacteria? And it's mind-blowing in a way, at least to me. Next slide. And just one abstract. There's a tremendous amount of research, but the hippocampus is where our memories lie, okay? And here's an article that basically shows how our vagal nerve, with all its innervation in the gut, is sending information and regulating our memory center. So we better take care of that gut, is the bottom line. Next slide. Here's the bottom line. If we're inflamed, which again is how we take care of the gut, there's a risk of ADHD, autism, Tourette's, depression, suicidal thinking, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease. There's gluten ataxia, ganglionopathy, peripheral neuropathy, and gluten psychosis. High fructose impacts memory and learning. So if we want to remain healthy and vibrant, say in my stage of life, if you will, it's the gut that I've got to protect to keep us from running into these disorders. Next slide. Next slide. It's like a repeat. If you want to take care of your brain, take care of your gut, of course, is the summary. Next slide. What about our arteries? Okay. Yes, we want to protect our brain. We also know we want to protect our arteries, our carotids. If they get calcified, they can give us strokes. Next slide. For that, we have to visit the Samani. They live in the Bolivian Amazon rainforest. They're hunter-gatherers. Next slide. This is the Samani. Next slide. They only eat non-processed carbohydrates, rice, corn, fruits, protein, and they hunt lean wild game and fish. Next slide. That didn't show, but the bottom line, it was two little girls from the Samani out in the surrounding countryside, and they were gathering mushrooms, other items that you can gather. So Dr. Thomas from the Memorial Care Heart and Vascular Institute in Long Beach Memorial heard about these people that apparently were very long-lived. And he wanted to know, well, could this be true? He took a team from his hospital and went down to where the Samani live in the Amazon rainforest and asked them, would they come to the big city, Trinidad, to have CT scans of their carotid arteries. It took them 2 days by river and 6 hours by jeep to get out from where they live, showing us how isolated they were, if you will, to Trinidad. Next slide. And the bottom line is they have the healthiest carotid arteries in the world. So 85% had no plaques, 12% low risk. So a total of 97% had no or low cardiovascular risk. They basically have the physiology of a 20-year-old, is what the specialist and the scientists noted. They had, again, the world's youngest looking arteries, and they had lower heart rates, blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood sugar compared to the rest of the world. Next slide. So what does that mean? Well, here, Suzanne and I are visiting a community garden up in the mountains. We, as often as possible, we need to make sure we get good natural foods. Next slide. Next slide. Our garden at home is, back up a little bit. Back up one slide. Can you back up? Is small, although the kale, as you saw to the right, was booming. Next slide. That's fine. We'll move on. Move on. Next. You can consider intermittent fasting. I'm not sure why those are jumping so quickly. And there's a lot you can read about online. Next slide. Let's move on to fitness. This will be fairly brief. Next. These are the fitness guidelines from the U.S. government. I don't want you don't need to read them. They're available online. The key concept of fitness is that it should be a combination of aerobic activity and muscle strengthening. I think a lot of people do aerobic. They may do long walks, bicycle rides, swimming, but you want to add that with muscle strengthening to your level and allow yourself to grow over time. Next slide. Then we all know about steps, I think. 7,000 steps in this study does the job. The Japanese popularized 10,000 steps. Just to look back at the Samani, the women have 16,000 steps per day and the men 17,000. So you pick a number, but at least go to 7,000 steps a day if you can. Next slide. activities. Again, these are from some of our handouts. They're multiple. I won't go into all of these. There are examples there. Next slide. This is just June 19th. An anti-hunger hormone was found if we exercise. So exercise helps us. Next slide. What about exercise in the brain? We tend to think of exercise as building the body, toning, strength, endurance, and those kind of things. Well, exercise is important to cognitive activity. Exercise induces what's called neurogenesis. It's creating new brain cells for us. So we should begin to think as exercise is not only good for the body, but good for the brain. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is released by the brain in aerobic exercises, increases our connections to the brain, helps improve the hippocampus, and thus improves our memory. Next slide. Yoga. Yoga is one of the best exercises for those that can. Here's our oldest son some years back. It helps us calm down. It decreases the risk of heart disease and blood pressure. It decreases atrial fibrillation. It relaxes our arteries. Next slide. Flexibility, strength, improves breathing, reduces anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. Next slide. So if you can, this is a powerful. Now, is there evidence? You bet. And there's a lot of evidence. We all know about MRI. There's a functional MRI, and there's a SPECT scan. And altogether in 11 studies, 288 yoga practitioners were tested here. And what did they find? The positive effects to the hippocampus, our memory center, amygdala, our fight and flight area, the prefrontal cortex, which is our executive where we control things, the cingulate cortex, emotions, the default mode network. So multiple things are benefited by this practice. Next slide. I think you can see why it's so popular. Let's move on to mind health. Next slide. There are a number of ways to keep your mind active. Suzanne, for instance, loves Duolingo, learning a second language. It's an app online. It's straightforward but challenging. So if you're going to go to Spain, then you're going to want to learn some Spanish, or to another country. So these activities foster the growth of new brain cells. Next slide. Suzanne also loves Wordle from the New York Times. It's a challenging puzzle. You get a few letters, and then you have to enter what you think the rest of the grid is going to look like. Crossword puzzles are actually very beneficial. Next slide. Next slide. And I can't read all this, but this is puzzles. I mean, I knew there were benefits, but I couldn't imagine that, it benefits both right and left, problem solving skills, short-term memory, visual spatial reasoning, et cetera, et cetera. So next slide. Go figure, just from playing puzzles. And we would get on our kids years back, you can't do those video games all the time. Well, now they're telling us it's time to do video games. Improves our memory, problem solving, brain connectivity, visual spatial memory and attention. Next slide. This lady is rewiring her brain. You can tell she's focused. She's got a task ahead. The brain needs to know what it wants to do. She's getting better. She is building her brain. There's just no question. You can see the attentiveness, beautiful hands, so she can manage that keyboard. Next slide. This lady is from Brazil. At the age of 60, she decided to start taking photos, which is awesome, okay? Within 6 months, she's invited to Venice, Italy, to present her work, okay? So we all need to challenge ourselves. I mean, it's hard to go to this level, there's no doubt, but there are multiple challenges out there. Next slide. For me, it's been one of my longest hobbies has been black and white photography. Next slide. And you can see this was a march of our lives, march here in Denver about 5 years ago. Next slide. And I think that slide speaks for itself. Next. For me, I haven't painted in 40 years and decided to paint this, what appears to be a rather stark painting. It has a lot of meaning, those 4 red bars. Next slide. Marked the foundation of Catalonia. I'm sure a number of you have been to Spain and Barcelona in that area. That's Catalonia. And the history is dipping his 4 fingers in the wound of Wilfred the Hairy, and then drawing those 4 fingers out on a golden shield to create the Catalan flag. Next slide. We need to take mental breaks, which is good. I was glad to latch into this area online and kind of make sure we talk about it. Naps, meditation, walks in nature. Mental breaks increase our productivity, replenish attention, solidify memories, and encourage creativity. Next slide. So how do we break? Well, one of the deepest ways is meditation. There are 3 types of meditation. Focused attention you might do in a yoga class. There's what's called open monitoring. I'll just mention automatic self-transcending. This is a great little book on this type of meditation. Next slide. When I was 21, I went to Humboldt State College in Northern California and spent a month learning with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Now, in all disclosure, I was one of 1,000 other people there. So, but nevertheless, I meditated for a number of years. It was wonderful. It was my internship in surgery that just simply knocked it out of me. And I won't go into those details, but getting up at 4:30 a.m. to be at the hospital at 5:30 to draw the blood, so the residents would have it at 6:30 so they could meet with the attendings at 7:30. Next slide. And intermittently, I've gone back to TM, although I've not done it regularly. Bottom line is that TM can take us down to the resting level of the brain, what's called the default mode network. There is no, it's easy is the best way to be. There's no concentration. There's no real focus. There's basically allowing a mantra to reach these lower levels. And in the meantime, you're just releasing thoughts that, are scattered. It's almost like stress release. Next slide. You don't need to be in any guru clothing, although that's fine if you like. And you're resting, you're closing your eyes, using your mantra. You have to be trained to do this. And the ideal is twice a day. And again, the EEG results show significant improvement. Next slide. But nature therapy, one of the areas most fascinating to me lately is they're beginning to learn the factors, the chemicals, the EEG changes we get in being in areas that most of us love. And I would say all of us love. Water, the outdoors, the green. Next slide. So it's amazing. A time in nature increases gray matter, white matter, the prefrontal cortex, the motor cortex, the cerebellum. Increased attention span in ADHD, happiness, it settles the amygdala. Next slide. So it's wonderful to find the water, being close to water. Of course, only on vacations are we going to be this close to water, but being Blue Mind goes to the deep new knowledge about how water itself rivers, lakes, etc., affect, and we know it. I mean, if it's a Sunday on the lake, you're going to feel better. Next slide. Dancing, though, don't forget dancing. I'm sure there are a number of dancers out there. I don't think we dance like this, or most of us don't anymore. Wouldn't know how. Next slide. But dancing stimulates various regions of the brain. The frontal lobe shuts down in dancing. I'll have to study into that a little more. That's fascinating. Dance embraces aspects of music, physical exercise, and mental health. Next paragraph, next slide. Jan Swaffer, who wrote a long biography on Beethoven, believes that dance is a kind of trance. Next slide. And here, if you want the most brain health dancing, it's Bharatanatyam. I'm sorry about that, those who know how to pronounce that. But it has a unique aspect or impact on the brain. It is really about storytelling, facial impressions with the vigorous physical element. So these ladies are getting their brain nourished, if you will, in multiple ways during this process. Next slide. Now, if you're only going to pick one to start with, I would learn about pranayama. It is a breathing tool. Yoga classes teach it, but you can do pranayama in an isolated fashion. It really, I mean, this is used in teaching in prisons, in schools of children that may, be stressed or delinquent, et cetera, et cetera. It corrects mood imbalances, reduces anxiety and depression, can improve post-traumatic stress disorder. And basically, I won't read the rest, but pranayama is something to consider if you just want a good stress relief. Next slide. There's, as part of pranayama, one of the common breathing modes is 4-7-8 type breathing that you can learn just online, look for a video. There might be different approaches, but 4-7-8 is a common breathing rhythm that just basically seems to change a lot of neurophysiology and a lot of just neurochemistry in our bodies. Next slide. The physiological effects: improved hypertension, digestive function, immune function, lung health, reduces asthma, COPD, helps us relax. Next slide. And then our last topic is, of course, sleep. Next slide. And prepping for sleep begins in the morning. Next slide. And this has been known since 8,000 years ago. The Indian Vedas take a walk in the rising sun. So they knew something was important about getting sunlight early in the morning. And it turns out it's resetting our circadian clocks. It's locking it in, if you will, for the day, for you not only to have a good day, but then getting into a good sleep. So whenever possible, get some rising sun. I know nowadays some of us are at work at 6:30 in the morning. There's not going to be sun. Next paragraph, next slide. 15 to 40 minutes. But this was interesting. What about an overcast sky? I'm not getting the sun. Well, as a matter of fact, even a short 20-minute walk outdoors overcast sky gives us 40,000 lux hours of light, exposes us to 40,000, more than 30 times what we get inside of an office today or inside of our homes. So we evolve outdoors, and our brains and our bodies are still tuned in to how we evolve. And that's why we enjoy getting out, especially on a sunny day. Next slide. I'm almost done. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into fasting. Back up just a little bit. Back up one slide. Well, that's okay. Sleep prep. Avoid eating after time-restricted eating. You know, you've heard of fasting. Some people get too carried away with it. But taking periods of not eating are indeed helpful to our physiology. And there are different approaches. It improves your sleep, an 8-hour plan of meals. Let's say you're going to eat from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. can be a way of doing a fast that's not too intensive that can help in your health recovery. Next slide. Next. Sleep prep. You know, it's interesting. There's also some evidence to get out in the evening light. Can you back up one slide? And in the evening light helps us, again, get settled for sleep. There are different things. Avoiding electronic screens at night, of course, that caffeine and alcohol at the end of the day. Late evening exercises, all these can interrupt our sleep. Next slide. Next. Tea, melatonin, those other items or options. Magnesium, though, is the one that has a lot of benefits for sleep, okay? I won't read all of these, but look into magnesium because it helps reverse age-related sleep architecture. So for some of those of us out there that have age on them, our sleep architecture is naturally changing, if you will. Magnesium can help reverse or limit those changes. Next. We're almost. Next. Yoga Nidra is a type of yoga that helps relaxation, guided sleep meditation. There are sleep apps. You do want a quiet, dark environment. Next slide. And these will be available online for those. You want a cool room, a quiet room, and a dark room. And what some advise is taping those little red lights on your ceiling in your room. I've used Dream Essentials now for 5 or more years. They're light, they're comfortable. I don't have to worry about stray light. I would, for those of you who are having sleep issues, I would strongly recommend looking at Dream Essentials or another similar brand. Next slide. Next. Now, and I'm certainly guilty of this, late at night, back up please one, late at night, I'm browsing on my phone. What does that do? That actually keeps me awake. Blue light basically keeps us awake. So wear blue blocking glasses that block the blue light if you're one of those that are going to read your cell phone or iPad or other device at night. We want to dim our nights to brighten our days. Next slide. Almost. Next. Resources next. You know, there are a number of books. I mean, here's some examples. Next. Next. Here's some others, How to Be Well, Boost Your Immune System. There are also these podcasts. There are many other podcasts. These are the ones I tend to follow, not religiously, but nevertheless, they're very helpful. The top one by Dr. Mark Hyman from the Cleveland Clinic is frankly excellent. Next slide. Next. And I think my summary would be as follows. We live in a challenging world. The more we nourish our spiritual, mental, and physical health, the more grounded we become, and the more we can be better, we can be there for others. So with that, I thank you. I hope you got something out of it. And I know this will be online if you'd like further review. Thank you very much.
Okay, just do we have any questions based on Dr. Oro's presentation? Questions? Okay, we have one here.
Sure. Thank you.
Eric will translate the question so that we can get it.
Oh, good.
So I just want to say that I agree with 99.9% of your advice on nutrition and exercise. I do want to sprinkle a small word of caution for the women among us. It's no secret that women's physiology is different than men's, and I think it's important to understand that a lot of the research in those areas has been done on men in the past. I encourage people to look up good peer-reviewed articles on nutrition and exercise. There's evolving research into women's health, especially perimenopausal women. So if people need good resources for that, I have some. Just a comment more than a question.
Eric, does Dr. Oro have any resources possibly specifically for women?
No. That's specific to women and nutrition and health. I do not. I mean, it's usually both genders that are recommended. I think. So the email to reach me is chiarimedicine.com, or that's it's chiarimedicine at iCloud.com. I think try that. So you can reach me individually, or maybe through ASAP, they can share that with you. But no, the bottom line is I've not seen one specifically for women in this area. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions for Dr. Oro? Right here.
Good morning. I love your recommendations, but one of my concerns as a allergy immunology specialist, I see a lot of these patients are quite symptomatic, such that they won't be able to adopt a lot of the diets that were recommended. And I think it would be important to have guidance on how to start administering foods in order to start restoring that imbalance that has happened over years, because these patients have a tendency to be quite symptomatic for a long time, and it takes a long time to just kind of slow down the damage, and then also to kind of rebuild the gastrointestinal tract. And I also would encourage that this is not only just about gut health, this is about respiratory health. There's a lot of focus, and you brought it up with breathing, but we all are in environments where we're breathing in 18 times per minute in environments that we don't have any control over. So there's something to be said about not only doing breathing exercises, but doing things to help improve the respiratory health, starting with the nose.
Well, okay, she was making a comment about those two areas. Okay, well, I accept it. There was so much reverberation I couldn't hear it.
Okay.
Appreciate it, though.
Any other questions? Okay, Eric, I think we're done with the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, the team. All right, bye-bye. Thank you.